Greetings. It's the last lecture on behaviorism. Today we're going to talk about Albert Bandura, social learning theory, criticisms of behaviorism, because we can't just let it stand that operant and classical conditioning are the only way to learn anything. Let's start here. I'm going to load this document into your course shells in a second. If I can remember how to load the thing, here we go. All right, so I'm going to load this thing into your course shell in a little bit. So here's the plan. We're starting here with Bandura and the idea of the Bobo Doll. So let's watch a little bit of video to start with. Let's watch. I'm not sure I can. Oh, here we go. All right. So this lady is going to be the model, and that horrible inflatable clown doll she's playing with, that's the Bobo Doll. I know you've never heard of the Bobo Doll. It was a terrible toy. Nobody liked it. But that's it. It's an inflatable clown, and it has sand in the base, so when you punch it in the nose, it stands back up again. Then here's a child, and the first child had not watched the model. The second child had watched the model. There's a little girl having seen the model. Okay. That's good enough. That's Albert Bandura himself. And he could probably do a better job explaining the experiment, but he's not around to do it, so here I am. Let's go back to this document. There we go. All right. So Albert Bandura, it's like 1958 or something, and all that there is on television is Westerns and cartoons, right? So the TV landscape is absolutely dominated by Western shows, and by Western shows, in the modern age, we'd call them cowboy and Indian shows, because what happens is the cowboys in the white hats are being attacked by Indians, and you can tell the cowboys are the good guys because they're white and their hats are white, and they just murder all the Indians to death and solve all their problems. It's incredibly violent, incredibly violent. Today, that content is not on television anymore. It was racist. It was uber violent. At the time, people justified it by saying it was cathartic. Okay, so the idea of catharsis is we're all walking around with strong emotions. You feel hostile, you feel angry, you feel aggressive. But if you can just sit down and watch some cowboys murder some Indians, then you'll experience those emotions in a particular context, and then you don't have to have those emotions anymore, right? So watching other people enact violence gets the violence out of your system. You can be done with it. And so a society that watches a bunch of violent content would be a less violent society. Bandura is not so sure about this. Albert Bandura thinks that watching violence, particularly unrealistic and cartoon violence, is just going to encourage more violence. Let me make a note to myself here. Okay. Right, so watching violence, the other stuff that's on TV is, it's like Bugs Bunny and Tom and Jerry, and what happens in Bugs Bunny cartoons, right? Elmer Fudd, shh, be very, very quiet. I'm hunting rabbits. And he catches up with Bugs Bunny, and then Bugs tricks him into shooting himself with a shotgun over and over again, right? Duck season, rabbit season, and Daffy Duck gets blasted in the face with a shotgun over and over. What happens in Tom and Jerry? Jerry whacks Tom in the face with a shovel, and the shovel takes on the shape of Tom's face, and Tom's face doesn't collapse. He doesn't go to the hospital, or die on the spot, which is what should happen. So kids are watching this stuff. Now they're watching the cowboys shoot the Indians and everything's fine and they're heroes. And they're watching Tom and Jerry and Bugs Bunny and Elmer Fudd and Daffy Duck just get abused in the most fantastic ways and suffer no consequences for that. Bandura's thinking, right, is catharsis really happening, or is this stuff creating more problems than it solves? So the Bobo Doll experiment, the model is shown on a television exactly because Bandura is worried about television violence. So here's the setup. There's a playroom, and the playroom has a bunch of toys in it. The inflatable clown is one of the toys in the playroom. It's not a popular toy, so just bear that in mind as we work through this. Children go into the playroom one at a time, not together, but various children will go in the playroom, and either they've viewed the video of the model abusing the clown, or they have not viewed the model, right? So those two conditions. Condition one, we just go straight in the playroom. Condition two, we watch the video first, then we go into the playroom. And then in the video, the model that you saw, that lady, she abuses the Bobo Doll, and she does so in some really specific ways. You know, the way you're supposed to play with the clown is you set it on the ground and you punch it in the face, and it falls over, but it stands back up again, and it's very entertaining, I guess. That's not what she does. She punches it in the face, but she also goes full MMA on it, right? You can see her knock it down and then get on top of it and smack it in the face with both fists, and then she picks up a hammer that goes in another play set and she smacks him in the face with the hammer. All the while she's doing this, she's using some really unique, arbitrary language to insult the Bobo Doll. Like, I don't even know what she says because the videos are all silent, but maybe she says, "You're a gross, boring nerd," or some really specific insult that no child on planet Earth would come up with on their own, right? That's important. So if the child did not view the video before going into the playroom, I mean, the Bobo Doll is not a good toy. People don't like it. Just walk by it and they play with the other stuff. You know, there's the Susie Homemaker set, because it's 1958, get off my back. And there's a tether ball, there's a basketball, and there's a cap gun. They ignore that as well. But the children who observed the model before going in the playroom, they go straight to the doll. And they do exactly what the model did with the doll. You watched her pick it up and drop it, for example, and they pick it up and they drop it. And they, of course, they punch it, but they go full MMA on its face, right? And they get the hammer from the other play set and they smack it in the face. But yeah, and they use the specific language. They call him whatever she called him. "You're a gross, boring nerd," whatever she said. Some really improbable language for like a 6-year-old, right? But then they elaborate on the language and they elaborate on the behavior as well. So they've learned something bigger picture, right? What they've learned is not just how to abuse the Bobo Doll, but that the Bobo Doll is worthy of abuse. Not only to enact aggression against it, but that it's worthy of aggression. So some of the children, I think the little boy you saw in the video, they actually go and get the cap gun and literally pop a cap in the Bobo Doll. All right. So they elaborate and they escalate. So this experiment is showing that people learn not only by randomly enacting behavior and then being reinforced or punished or ignored for that behavior. We learn by observing other people's behavior and then imitating that behavior. So early social learning theory suggested that we'd observe behavior and then we'd see the model rewarded or punished for doing the behavior, and then we'd act accordingly, right? If they were rewarded, we'd repeat their behavior. If they were punished, we would not repeat their behavior. But we do stuff just because we see other people do it, rewarded, punished, or otherwise, it doesn't really have that much of an effect. Okay, so we're all curious little monkeys. Monkey see, monkey do. You see other people do stuff, you do the stuff. Fashion's a great example of this. People aren't really rewarded or punished that much outside of high school for wearing certain kinds of clothes. It's just things get popular, and there's no way to predict how things are going to get popular. Beanie Babies in the early 90s, that toy just sold like crazy. There's no explanation for why it sold like crazy. People saw other people buying it, and then they figured it must be popular, and so they bought it, but no one was really, in the early days, rewarded or punished or ignored for buying or not buying Beanie Babies, So there's that. This experiment forever altered the language, the landscape of children's entertainment. Yeah, those cartoons, Bugs Bunny and Tom and Jerry, they originated as shorts to show between features at double features at movie houses before there was really television. Certainly before there was television in every home. So they started being shown on television in the 1970s, 1980s. They were everywhere, and they'd be targeted at children. They were made for adults. The jokes in Bugs Bunny and Tom and Jerry are often very, very sophisticated jokes. You need to be sort of embedded in the culture of the 40s and the early 50s to get them. They were targeted to children. When television comes about, they're put on in the like 7 to 9 o'clock block on the three major stations that existed at the time. Bandura is concerned about this. The original versions of these programs were incredibly racist. They probably should have never been on the air. The only black people in the shows are housekeepers, and Bugs Bunny says some really insensitive, racist, sexist stuff that doesn't really bear repeating. They were edited down over time as we got more sensitive to these issues, but the violence, man, that unrealistic cartoon violence remained. So Tip O'Neill, the Congress of the 80s comes along, and they sort of take Bandura's findings and run with them, and they come up with laws that children's entertainment targeted to children, that Saturday morning block, it has to be educational or informative, and the cartoon violence is sort of done away with. So Tom and Jerry, by 1985, certainly Tom and Jerry's gone off the air. There's no way to justify that unrealistic cartoon violence anymore. Tom and Jerry comes back, but it comes back as Tom and Jerry Friends. So what happens is Jerry the mouse and Tom the cat and Spike the neighborhood bulldog, the bigger bully, right? Instead of just fighting with each other and hitting each other with shovels and pushing each other down cheese graters and stuff like that, instead of all that, they wake up and they find that there's some problem in the neighborhood, and then they cooperate to solve the neighborhood problem together, and everybody hates it. The children all turn off Tom and Jerry Friends, and they go outside and like blink at the sun that they haven't seen in a generation and play stickball or whatever we did before cartoons. So now you have like Cartoon Network, and we can just show cartoons all day, every day, and cartoons start to come back with the unreal, because we can always say they're not targeted for children, right? They're not in that block in the morning when we're expecting children to be sitting there with their bowl of chocolate frosted sugar bombs before moms got out of bed to supervise. So that happened. Okay. Was Bandura right? Is it that watching these things, in fact, does not create catharsis, but leads us to emulate the behaviors that we've seen and leads to a more violent, uncaring society? Well, I'm afraid to say the jury's somewhat still out on this. Now, it might seem obvious. So let's say you have a house full of teenage boys, 14 to 17-year-old boys, and you need to go to the liquor store and get a cigar and a bottle of Sterno or something, and you leave them watching WWE wrestling on the television for the half hour or so it takes you to get to the shops and back again. Like, what condition can you expect the house to be in when you get back, having left teenage boys unattended watching wrestling? Exactly. Someone has thrown someone else into the glass coffee table, and someone has a cut that needs stitches, and you're not spending the night quietly anymore. You're at the ER, right? So it seems really obvious. Monkey see, monkey do. What they see is violence. What they do is violence. But it's more complicated, right? As you should know from this class by now, it's complicated. So I want to pose this question. Pornography, is that good for society? So we've done, our government has done a couple of studies on this, one in the 1950s and another in the 1980s, all right? So the study that happened in the 50s really focused on individuals. What we'd do is we'd get ratings from men about what sorts of behaviors that they would endorse or consider to be moral, okay? So men would either view violent pornography or not view violent pornography, and then take a questionnaire. And some of the questions in the questionnaire about violence towards women and sexual violence towards women. And as you might predict, the men who had viewed violent pornography were more likely to endorse violence, and especially sexual violence towards women, than men who had not viewed any pornography. And that seems to uphold Bandura's findings on the topic. Okay, good. But remember that the psychologist always has to take the biopsychosocial approach, right? And all we've done here is taken the psychological approach. We've studied one individual at a time. So is pornography good for a person? Almost certainly not. Almost certainly it's not good for a person. These findings are fairly persistent, okay? The more violent is the pornography you're watching, the more violent attitudes that you'll endorse towards women, sexism, expectations, like people don't really look like that with their clothes off, and she doesn't really want to do that with you, probably, and there's a thing called porn creep, right? You've been reinforcing yourself for looking at this content, and when that content's no longer around, you've sort of dissociated the pleasurable feelings of sexual activity from actual sexual contact. So that can start to cause sexual dysfunction. So that's all, pornography almost certainly bad for a person, okay? But for society, okay? So the second study comes along in the 1980s, and they're looking at Japan in particular, and there's one of the Northern European countries, and I can never quite remember which one it was, that legalized all forms of pornography in the early 1980s. So what we do is we look at the country and we compare rates of violent crime, and in particular sexual violence, before and after legalizing pornography. I don't know if you've been to Japan, but pornography is not just legal there, it's completely accepted and acceptable. So you walk past newsstands, and there's like manga comics on the bottom row where 4-year-olds are walking by on their way to the train to go to school and whatever. Tentacle porn, just all kinds of outrageous stuff. And there's old ladies reading really horrible, violent sexual content on the train with everybody else looking. And it's just really normal and pervasive. And so what happened to Japanese society as this happens? If Bandura is right, then rates of violence and sexual violence in particular should increase, and that's not what happened. They decreased. In the second country they studied, they also decreased. So you can make the case that pornography is bad for an individual, but good for society. But wait up a second. What's science rule one? I know like 4 of you are going back in your notes to find science rule one. Science rule one, remember, is never infer causation from correlation, and that's the nature of our relationship, isn't it? Right? There's a rate of sexual violence, and then we legalize pornography, and then sexual violence comes down. Can we say that legalizing pornography caused a decrease in sexual violence in these two countries? No, we cannot. We absolutely should refrain from doing that. The much more likely culprit here is liberalism, that these two nations went from being broadly authoritarian nations to broadly open liberal societies, okay? One thing among a whole raft of things that a liberal society does is it refrains from censorship. Authoritarian censor, and liberal societies say, what we want to do is provide everyone with good information and then trust them to make good decisions, right? So we can certainly warn you that pornography tends to be bad for individuals, but we're not going to put a blanket ban on that. You know, what you do in the privacy of your home is really, it's not germane to us. You're not infringing on the rights of others. Your right to swing your fists ends where my nose begins, but you watching whatever content you want in your house by yourself, that doesn't make any contact with me and my rights. So we don't do that. That's just one of a host of things that a liberal society does. So in the interest of providing good information and then trusting people to make good decisions, we're hands off on that, right? We provide you information about smoking and then just trust that you don't smoke. We provide you information about global warming and then trust that you will vote for people who understand global warming is real and needs to be regulated, okay? So there's really two ways to destroy a liberal society. One is to change how people's votes count, right? So that is voter disenfranchisement, the war on drugs, we talked about that. That is voter ID laws, where like your NRA membership card is good enough, but your student membership card isn't, because these guys vote for one team and these guys vote for the other team. It's closing down polling places in poor Black neighborhoods, because those are people who tend to vote for one particular team, but having extra, right, extra voting facilities in places where old people are, because elderly citizens in America are more likely to vote. They're more likely to vote for the other team, right? It's gerrymandering. It's at the moment the electoral college, so your vote in Montana counts. For your presidential vote in Montana counts like 30 times as much in Montana as it does in California, right? So changing how votes count, that's one way to destroy liberal democracy. The other way is to change information itself. It's to destroy information. So you start to see, as we saw in the video about the climate change misinformation, disinformation, right? You start to see the rise of Soviet-style tactics of misinformation, disinformation, rolling disclosure, smear campaigns, smear tactics, the use of classical conditioning to make the primary emotion in electoral politics disgust, even over and above anger, which arguably was always there, right? Disgust as the primary feeling. So, you know, we can't say that Bandura was completely wrong, but we can say that the pornography probably not good for society, but censorship worse for society, right? So that's how we get to there. What else do we need to talk about? So that's Bandura done and dusted, and then we move on to some really basic critiques of behaviorism, right? So we read the book, and the chapter it's called learning, but there's no learning in it. When we do the memory chapter, you'll find everything important about learning is in the chapter on memory, okay? The way that we do learning in classrooms, someone's dispensing information, and helping you integrate that information with examples and making it personal and repetition, all that stuff, right? It's in the memory chapter. So we just can't let it go with no criticism. Okay, so criticism number one is who decides which behaviors to reinforce or punish or make extinct? Who decides what's good behavior? One of the major problems that psychology has across the board is that we teach you how to do all this stuff, but we completely divorce it from any discussion about ethics. Okay, so the stuff gets out into public with no guidelines. You know, we tell you that it's perfectly acceptable to train your spouse to pick up their socks by having nice words for them when they pick their socks up and ignoring them when they don't pick their socks up. Is that okay? Is that okay? Is it okay to use it in? Is it okay to use it in politics and sales and so on? We've totally divorced this from any kind of ethical or even moral principles. That's not all right. All right. So I've used behaviorism. It's good. It's true. It's productive. It's often the only thing you can do, right? So I'm an existential psychologist. My preferred mode of operation is to sit knee to knee and eye to eye with people in some form of distress and try to understand them as a person and their perception of their problems and their internal experiences. But most of my career has been working with people who experience developmental disabilities. They're just not capable of explicating, of talking about their internal experiences. They can't tell me about them. I can't relate to them. And it's not even clear that they're having internal experiences in the way that people with language have those internal experiences, that they often seem to be just enacting primary process without any reflection, without any self-reflection. So what do we do with people in those cases? We use behavioral principles. Groups of people, children, right? A group of people is not really likely to have the time or the ability or the process to reflect on their experiences. Children don't have a sense of self yet. So what do? We use behavioral principles, but we use them really carefully, you know. Before I can institute a behavioral program with my clients of disability, I have to prove that the behavior meets some basic criteria. If the behavior is causing imminent risk of harm to self or others, then I can intervene with that behavior and I can draw up a behavior plan. If there's any rights restrictions, I have to have those approved by a human rights commission. But I more or less freely can intervene in that behavior, and I can take emergency actions to prevent the behavior when it's happening. So things like the person is about to run out into traffic, of course I can physically prevent them from running out into traffic. And then we're going to do a behavior plan to attempt to stop that behavior happening in the future. Interferes with the rights of other people. So Steve likes to walk around his house naked, but Steve shares a house with other people who don't want to see Steve naked. Okay, now I need a behavior plan to stop Steve from doing that. What else? In the last case, it would interfere with the person's own stated goals. So maybe Buddy wants to save up for a vacation in Hawaii, but in order to do that, Buddy needs to go to work. And he doesn't have any friends. So his friends are all the characters on the original Star Trek. And it's only on like Nick at Night on Wednesdays and Thursdays at midnight. So he stays up all night long watching Star Trek, right? Because his friends, Kirk and Spock and McCoy, are on Star Trek. But if he stays up at night, then he sleeps in the morning and he misses the bus to go to work to earn the money to do that Hawaii thing. So we can have a conversation with him and get him to agree that we're going to do a behavior support plan that's going to help him go to bed on time, get up on time, make that money, meet that goal. Okay, really specific set of circumstances. You usually don't have to change the world though in order to get this work done. This is modernity, right? We can DVR Star Trek, or we can stream it, and in the modern world you can watch the original series whenever you want. There's no reason to stay up all night doing it anymore. So we could probably, in modernity, we could probably solve that problem without a behavior support plan or rights restrictions, just a little bit of creativity and basic human decency. Okay. So there's that. Who decides which behaviors to reinforce or punish or extinguish? Who decides what is good behavior, what is bad behavior? It's an incredibly important question that we never teach you to ask until you're in doctoral candidacy. All right. So there's that. Who has the moral authority to punish another human being? Do you have the moral authority to punish your children? Well, as a society, we've largely agreed yes, within particular constraints. I know people think I'm some outrageous liberal propagandist sometimes, but the thing about it, it makes the rounds on the social media that liberals don't want you to spank your children, and if you spank your children, you're going to get in trouble, and we're trying to make it a crime, and no one's really saying that. Okay, that's just the politics of division happening. But this is a liberal society, and I do get to tell you that the more you hit your children, probably the worse you're making things, and then trust you to make a decision about whether or not to hit your children. And we'll do more on that here in a few minutes. But adults, who has the moral authority to put adult human beings in prison? Okay, my clients who experience developmental disabilities are all adults, and they have the same civil rights as anybody else. So if Chuck doesn't want to finish his dinner, can I punish him for not finishing his? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. And the second that I raise a hand to someone and inflict corporal punishment on a person of disability, that's abuse, that's assault, right? That's illegal. We can't do that. No one has vested in me the moral authority to punish other people, particularly other adult people. That, oh, you're in all kinds of legal and moral jeopardy on this one. All right. Is this the only way that we learn? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. The early behaviorists, they thought the only way to learn, or the only meaningful way to learn, was through conditioning. You're rewarded or punished, or stimuli or paired, or whatever it is. So one way that they can attempt to prove that is using a rat maze. So we're going to put a rat in a maze, and there's cheese in the middle, and we're going to time how long it takes to get to the cheese in the middle, and that time is T1. Now tomorrow, after it's gotten the cheese, we're going to put the rat back in the maze, and because it was reinforced for finding the middle, it finds the middle probably faster on the second trial, right? Which is called T2, and the time difference between T1 and T2, that's called learning. And that proves that rats reinforced for finding the center of the maze remember how to find the center of the maze. Okay, cool. But let's repeat that experiment. But now we're going to put in a time called T0. We're going to go before T1 and T2. So what's going to happen is I'm going to put some rats in the maze and just let them hang out there for half an hour. No cheese. They're not reinforced for finding anything in the maze. Okay. And then we're going to go to T1, where there's cheese in the middle of the maze, whatever food reinforcer rats actually like. Let's just keep saying cheese for now. We're going to put a rat in the maze, and now there is a reward in the middle, and they find the reward, and then tomorrow I put the rat back in the maze. And again, there's a difference between T1 and T2 caused by reinforcement, but there's a much greater difference when there's T0 than when there was not T0. This is the idea of latent learning, that the rat's just able to walk around the maze walked around and remembered it for no reason, without any reinforcement. Just by being exposed to the stimuli, they remembered the stimuli. Just by being in the territory, they created a mental map of that territory. No conditioning, no associations. We're mammals. That's just what mammals do, you know? You move to a new neighborhood and maybe you ride your bike around the block a few times and just get a feel for what's there and where everything is. When we're doing classes on campus, like 8 out of 10 people know where the bathroom is without ever having to ask, so where's the bathroom on this floor? Because you walk by it on your way to the class and you just, for no reason, right? You don't need to know at the moment for no reason. You just walk by it and you make a mental map of the places that you find yourself. Okay, at least humans do that. At least humans do that. Some of us don't. I'm autistic. I don't do that. I'm always lost. It's part of the disability. So there's a cute bumper sticker, goes on the back of some people's cars, and it's Gandalf with his stick, and he's saying, "Not all who wander are lost." True, but some of us are. If you ever see me wandering, I'm lost. Help me. Okay, so there's that. Politics, we talked about this already, Clinton, Benghazi, Clinton, Benghazi, Clinton, Benghazi, Trump, Russia, Trump, Russia, Trump, Russia, like that. The use of classical conditioning to make you feel disgust when you hear one name or the other, or sometimes both. Like, who decided that's okay? Where's the ethics? Where's the morality in this picture? It's not there. It's not even a consideration, This is 2020. It's deeply nihilistic, and winning is the only consideration. The dirtier tricks one side plays, the dirtier tricks the other side has to play in order to keep up, Maybe one candidate doesn't want to do negative ads, but the other side is doing so many negative ads that if this site doesn't, they're just going to lose because those ads work. Okay. So that's kind of the basic criticisms of behaviorism, like who decides, who has the moral authority. That's certainly not the only way that we learn. Let's stop calling it that. And like, who let this loose with no moral or ethical guidance. Okay. So the last thing we have to do is a discussion of punishment and why we don't do punishment in the modern world. So you're going to think I'm talking about your children and should you hit your children, and I'm not doing that. I'm saying as a professional, punishment is strictly forbidden in the psychological professions, and here's why. Number one, it's just ineffective. So our mantra is that punishment is not an effective means of behavior modification. Punishment is not an effective means of behavior modification. Now remember that behavior modification means that we've made it less likely that that organism will repeat that behavior in the future for reasons internal to the organism. And that's just not what happens. You can get compliance, right? When I say that, you're thinking, but I hit this person for doing a thing and they didn't do that thing again. You've merely gotten compliance, all right? Now, sometimes what you need is compliance. Your kid's gonna run out in the road. You don't have time to like craft a positive behavior support plan and enact it. You need to grab them and you need to somehow, by any means necessary, communicate to them that running in the road is unacceptable. A 3-year-old's not amenable to reason. Okay, so you're doing whatever you have to do to get compliance to keep them alive. So there's that. But there's other ways to get behavior change that are much more effective. Differential reinforcement, for example, which is where remember the example with Johnny, who lives with Steve. Steve has Prater Willie. Johnny's hungry every day at 4, right? I'm going to teach Johnny to make the sign for cookie instead of rattling the cabinets. I'm going to reinforce making the sign, and I'm going to no longer reinforce rattling the cabinets. Okay. And as I reinforce the behavior I want to see and just ignore the behavior I don't want to see, the problem behavior goes away on its own. I never attend to it. I don't punish it. I don't talk about it. I don't say, don't do that. I redirect, I ignore and redirect, get interested in something else. Okay. And that behavior, because it's less efficient, goes away on its own. Cleanly, immediately? Absolutely not. It's work. And you'll probably see like a spike in the problem behavior. You just have to be patient and work through that spike. And then the organism, the client, the patient, whatever, the kid gets the message that this behavior works, this behavior doesn't work. And then they exclusively do this behavior, the behavior that we wanted, right? So reinforce the behavior that you don't want to see and ignore the other behaviors. And that's far more effective than trying to punish. Just doesn't work. Punishment is immoral, and immoral, man, that's a tough thing for a scientist to say. All right, when you're going to do pure science, then you live in an amoral universe. There's no objectively verifiable standard for morality. You know, in this language, moral means right and wrong, and right and wrong are judged by authority, ultimately, namely God. But if God is talking to you, God's not talking to me. We're not getting the same messages from divine beings. There's argument over what those messages mean. Your texts are really inconsistent, and there's just no experiment that we can run that says this is right, this is wrong. And so what we're left with ultimately is an amoral universe where some things may in fact be more or less moral, more or less right or wrong, but we don't have a means of discerning the difference. But in this amoral universe, there's one sin left, and that sin is enforcing your moral structures with other people. Okay, and the more you have power and the other person doesn't, the more of a sin that is. People with IQs of 40 shouldn't be in church. They don't have the capacity to understand what's happening there. Most of the abuse that I've observed in my clients of disability has come from religious sources. It's people running group homes as a subdivision of their church practice, and they're trying to enforce behavior. The root word of enforce is force, and they're punishing people for not acting like good, upstanding members of the faith. But the people that they're punishing have IQs of 40 or 50 or 60, and they have no capacity to make decisions about what's right and wrong. But they're being often physically abused for failure to uphold those standards. That's wrong. That's the last sin in the amoral universe, is using your power to enforce your set of morality. Okay. What else, though? It's unethical, and unethical is easier to get at. If moral means right and wrong in this language, then ethics is what is acceptable or unacceptable. And we decide that. As a culture or a society or a practice, we decide that. So you can find ethics encoded in laws, for example. And hitting your disabled clients because they pee in their pants is illegal. That's assault. It's a short track to being defrocked and possibly incarcerated. Okay, so we don't do it. Another source of ethics is the ethics board. If you're going to practice as a psychologist, you need a license, and that license is regulated by DORA, the Department of Regulatory Agencies, and by the Psychological Ethics Panel that resides in Denver. There's an APA Code of Ethics. You need to read it. You need to abide by it. And that Code of Ethics says we don't punish our clients except under really specific, unique sets of circumstances. And those are emergencies. And we have like a plan, a system in place so that we can eventually stop doing that like as soon as is humanly possible. All right. So unethical. That means we have decided as a society, as a culture, as a practice, that we don't punish. If there's any other way of getting the job done, we just don't punish. All right. Why? What makes it so ineffective? What makes it so unethical? Number one, it damages relationships. If you're going to stick around in psychology over the next few years, you're going to learn that number one, the different ways of practicing psychology are always competing. So you have CBT over here, and Freudian analysis over here, and modern psychodynamics in that camp, and then you have humanism, and then you have whatever else. But we're always competing for like that insurance dollar, that Medicaid, Medicare dollar. So we always have to prove that we're the best way. The modern science, though, just doesn't endorse the idea that there's a best way to practice. This is called the dodo bird verdict. It's Norcross in, I don't know, 2004, 2005, that time frame. The dodo bird verdict is all have won and all shall have prizes. So all psychotherapy is robustly effective in his language. The effect size is 0.8, which in the crudest possible terms means approximately 80% of people who seek treatment from a psychological professional will get better. Okay, cool. But these findings, these meta-analytic findings, also find that the things we think are making people better are not the things making people better. There's a couple of like underlying factors, and the most important underlying factor turns out to be the relationship. So if you go to a psychologist or a psychological professional and you like them and you get along well, you're going to do well. You're going to get better. Okay, and if you don't like them, you're not going to get better, and that's it. That's really that's the end of the story. Of course, there are other factors that are important. This is the most important factor, and it's basically a decision gate. If there's not a good relationship, then the rest of the factors really recede in importance. It's very, very hard to overcome a problematic relationship. But what does punishment do? Does punishment create and maintain good relationships? No, it doesn't. It damages trust. Let's go back to the dog that we're training, and we have the puppy on the table, and we're teaching her to sit, and we take the cookie and we try and put it up under her chin so that she'll sit, the approach avoid conflict. What if you hit that dog? What if you habitually shout at, terrorize, terrify that dog? Then when you go to put that cookie up under her chin, she doesn't want you there. She's afraid, and she backs off warily. You can't do the beginning stages of training. What when we get to roll over and you need to grab the dog's feet and push them over so they understand? If they're scared of you, that's not going to happen, right? This applies well outside the scope of psychological treatments. At the beginning of class, I do this whole song and dance where I'm being my weird, outrageous, sometimes I know problematic self. Why? Because if you don't like me, you're not going to do well in the class. And it's absolutely fine that you don't like me. I need you to find that out on day 1 or day 2, though, right? Because have you been in that class with the professors you just can't get along with? The relationship, the attachment is an information channel. And if we don't get along, that channel's closed. Get it? So you're working with your clients of disability or children or dogs or therapy clients. You're using punishment on them. You're eroding trust. How do you expect them ever to get better? Not going to happen. Metacommunication. This idea comes from Virginia Satir. Satir was a family therapist and sort of an existentialist before we were talking about existentialism in the language we use today. and very, very important. She moved into the business community. You might have heard of her 4 basic rules. Virginia Satir, uh, so influential for so many psychologists. She talks about the idea of metacommunication. Metacommunication is the stuff that you communicate other than the words that you use, okay? So this idea stems from congruence, that you have thoughts, feelings, and actions. And your feelings and your thoughts should match. If you feel one way but think another, you're incongruent. And your thoughts and feelings and language should match, right? When you say one thing but do another, that's called hypocrisy. Are you telling your children not to smoke, but you're smoking? Well, you're incongruent there, right? You're sending mixed messages, you know? Hey, kid, don't smoke cigarettes. They'll mess up your lungs, man. I wish I heard someone when I was your age telling me don't smoke cigarettes. They're going to smoke. They're not hearing the words that you're saying. They're not seeing the effect of smoking on your body. Remember that monkey see, monkey do stuff from earlier? You could be deeply, deeply punished for smoking with cancer and the respirator and the voice box kit. But you're their hero, man. And so they see you smoking and they smoke, you know? They're getting an incongruent message, a mixed message. Now, let's say Johnny hits Sally. Let's say Sally hits Johnny. And so you grab Sally by the wrist and you say, Sally, don't hit. And you smack her right on the hand, right? So she'll associate pain with the act of hitting. And so you said with your mouth, you said, Sally, don't hit. But then you hit her, okay? What message is Sally to learn when you say don't hit, but you hit her? All sorts of problematic messages creep in there, right? Like, don't hit Johnny. Don't hit Johnny specifically. Or don't hit when I'm looking. And we find this all the time, where when you punish a particular behavior, the organism learns not to do that behavior as long as you're there. And then when you're not there, all bets are off. Kids go to college for the first time. They're 18 or 19 or something, and they've never been out from under their daddy's thumb before. Daddy said, if you ever take a sip of alcohol, if alcohol ever punishes your lips, I will beat the crap out of you. And Dad enforced that. But he's not around. Every year, maybe 4 kids, very young adults, they're at rush parties in Boulder, and we have to send them to the hospital and pump their stomachs. They drank so much that they had alcohol poisoning. They nearly died. We saved their lives, pumping their stomachs. And who do you think their parents were? Exactly. It's the young people who had the most authoritarian parents who, when outside that environment, have no idea how to behave, no idea how to act. They're free for the first time. They're going to do whatever they want. They haven't internalized any reasons not to drink. So they go crazy. So this is metacommunication. What else might Sally learn? Sally, don't hit. And you hit her. Might she learn that it's good to be the king, right? It's okay to hit if you're bigger. And maybe most heartbreakingly of all, she might learn we shouldn't hit, but it's okay to hit you. Don't hit people, but you're not a person. Hitting's disrespectful, but we don't owe you in particular any respect. So this is the idea of metacommunication. You're communicating some stuff about power. You might not mean to communicate that stuff about power. You have to find another way to convey the message. You can't say don't hit, but then hit. You can't say don't use power and authority, on people who are smaller and weaker, and then use power and authority on people who are smaller and weaker. That's hypocrisy, and kids will pick up on hypocrisy 7 days out of 7, okay? What else? We learned earlier that every behavior is an expression of one or more unmet needs. Johnny wants a cookie, that's why he's rattling the cabinets. If you can teach him a different way to get that need met, then he'll do that behavior instead of rattle the cabinets. Problem solved. But when you tell a person to stop doing something and then just punish them for doing it, they still have the need that they had. You haven't taught them any better or more effective or lower energy or more appropriate ways to get those needs met. Maybe you have maybe we're dealing with an autistic teenager, and I'm here to tell you that the environment is troubling for us. We have difficulty screening out irrelevant stimuli. All the stimuli in the environment often. Of course, it varies by individual, but for a lot of us, the environment's really overwhelming because you can focus on one stimulus and the other stimuli in the environment just sort of recede from consciousness. We can't. Like everything's equally loud. So you're at a restaurant and people are murmuring and having conversations. They're unpredictable. It's a burst of laughter over here, some plates dropped over there, and they're all arriving at our perceptive level with equal importance. It's very distracting. Our ears are very sensitive. Loud, high-pitched noises in particular, I experience as very, very painful. Well, one way that someone might defend themselves is by making noise. So in particular, the person who experiences autism, who's at a nonverbal level, they might make a loud, high-pitched wailing or screeching noise, because when you make a loud, high-pitched noise, your body knows you're about to do that, and your ear canals kind of tighten up a little so that you protect yourself from the noise that you're about to make. So it's serving a function, right? This loud, high-pitched noise is serving a function. Now, there was a program in New York where they had a couple of ways to punish teenagers for making these noises. Parents don't like it. You want to be able to go to the restaurant and your kid's invisible. They act normally. People aren't staring at you. You're not getting a bunch of unwanted attention. So right or wrong, they put their kids in these behavior modification programs, and the BMod used punishment. Okay, so in the program, in one version, you're outfitted with a bicycle helmet, and in the helmet there's a little servo motor. When you make the noise, the person following you around pushes the button, and there's a little thing that wraps on your head, right? So it gets your attention. You start making the noise, and the thing wraps you on the head, gets your attention, and it hurts a little bit. Okay. In another version, it is electric shocks, but the same principle. You're walking around, and the person shocks you for making the noise. So what happens is it's called inurement. Inurement is to punishment what satiation is to reinforcement, right? The dog eventually has had enough cookies, doesn't need any more cookies. The reward just doesn't offer any enticement for the behavior anymore. Well, in inurement, you've just gotten used to the punishment. It just doesn't really mean anything to you anymore. So think of a cat who wants to claw on the furniture, you know? Well, a cat has to claw on the furniture. It's a little murder muffin. Those claws, if they're not kept sharp, will start to itch and then to burn, and they'll drive the cat crazy until it goes and claws on the thing and sharpens its Freddy Krueger knives, you know what I mean? So how do you get the cat to stop clawing on the furniture? You could yell at it, squirt it with cold water, shake a can of pennies and make a loud noise, and all that animal is learning is that you're a jerk. It's doing a necessary behavior. It's not capable of evaluating the morals of damaging your property, you know? It has to do that behavior. So you can get it to run away when you shake the can or whatever, but you can't get it to stop doing that. Maybe you've squirted it with the cold water or shaken the can or whatever, and then it's 3 in the morning and you hear that scritching sound because Kitty's on the sofa doing what she has to do when you're not watching. You know, maybe you run down the stairs all naked and whatever, shaking your can and your cold water spray. Damn it, cat, get off my couch. They go and hide behind the furnace. But what have you done? You've damaged the relationship, and you haven't given them a way to meet that unmet need. So how do you get the cat to stop doing that? Use differential reinforcement. Basically you provide them a better way to sharpen their claws. You put a bad smell on the couch, bad to cats, not to you, you know, spray some off on there. And then you get them a scratching post, and you see the scratching post with catnip, and they go over there and they like it and they hang out, and they really quickly learn that the scratching post is way better for their claws than your furniture. And so the couch scratching thing goes down, the post scratching thing goes up, like that. So there's probably a time in your life where your parents always spanked you when you were bad, and you just learned one day that you could divorce from the feeling of being spanked. You could compartmentalize, you know. Your dad was hitting you and you turned around and you go, that didn't hurt. And so that makes dad madder and he hits you harder, and you just learned that it doesn't matter. And you go, well, that didn't hurt either. That didn't hurt. That didn't hurt. And they get madder and madder and hit you harder and harder. It has no effect on you anymore. You're totally inured to that. Well, that's what happened in these programs for the autistic kids. They have to make that noise. They're making that noise for a reason. And so the need to make the noise kind of overrides the need to not be squirted in the face with cold water or shocked or rapped on the head. And so they have to keep ramping up the punishments, higher voltage electric shocks and harder, more frequent raps on the head, until, you know, one kid gets some skin burns from the electric shock. One kid gets a subdural hematoma from being knocked on the head, dies in the hospital. You know, those programs are gone now, and lots of people who ran them are rotting in prison. Okay. So you're dealing with behavior. Remember, right? The very first rule of behaviorism is every behavior has an objective. Okay. And lastly, you know, sort of back to the meta communication a little bit, the use of authority just models and maintains the use of authority, right? So what sorts of practices would reduce bullying in schools? You would think that it would be a total zero tolerance policy towards bullying. One kid hits another kid, whatever the reason, any reason, they're out of here, you know, suspended, first offense, expelled, second offense. Does that change your behavior? Does it change your behavior? Well, like putting someone in prison, it contains their behavior. You can't bully the kids at this school if you're not at this school, right? It's impossible. But have you changed that individual's behavior? Or do they just wind up going to another school and doing the same thing? What you're trying to tell them is that bullying is wrong, but then you're using your authority to totally remove them from the environment. That's a really, really aggressive act. To disappear somebody, that is a really aggressive act. And you just shuffle them around the school districts. They don't learn anything. The more authoritarian the school is, the more bullying we see in that school. All right? The more liberal the school is, Classical liberalism, Enlightenment principles, not what Fox News has told you to think liberalism is. The more that we give people good information and then trust them to make good decisions with that information, the more that we enact modern policy, the less bullying there is in that school. Leadership starts at the top. The way the principals treat the teachers and the way the teachers treat the students trickles down. All right. Doesn't mean we're tolerant of bullying. We're still intolerant of bullying, but we set up judicial committees and we have the students make decisions about how the student who's offended, when they're found guilty, is to restore trust so that we can reintegrate them back into the student body. Maybe they spend hours painting out graffiti on the back fence. Maybe they restorative justice. They're doing service projects in the school to restore their standing at the school. And when they've done that, they're forgiven. They have to invest, in other words, in the school body. The more they invest in the school body, the more that they don't need the behavior of bullying. They've gotten the status that they were after by making this investment. So authoritarian practices just sort of breed more authoritarian practices. And if you want to live in a culture, a society that's not authoritarian, where you have freedom, then you have to reject authoritarianism, like at every level, every social strata. Okay. So that's a lecture for today. Thanks for joining me, and see you around the lecture circuit, I guess.